Geoffroy, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dion, for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into business in the first place. You're now running Ofload, and how did you progress to this stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I've kind of went with the boring kind of career path where it took minimal amount of risk, went for business school, then after business school kind of majored in M&A and financial markets, went into financial markets with a hedge fund for about two and a bit years. After that, I immigrated and moved to Australia and wanted to be a trader, which didn't happen. So a great humility check. And then I just landed in the startup world because it just happened to be where a couple of my mates and friends from business school were. And so I worked in the startup called HelloFresh. I loved the growth, loved the pace, loved the people, loved the way that you could be rewarded with tangible results. Mm-hmm. And you see truly the outcome of the work you put in. And so I got hooked with that kind of industry, and I was head of operations there. Then I saw an opportunity to actually take over a transport company, and so left HelloFresh, moved into being an entrepreneur and a general manager of a last mile company, which I sold about 2 years later. And from there, I just got hooked in being an entrepreneur and truly having the freedom to drive the change I want to see. And so that got me into being an MD for a startup called Zucal, to me starting two businesses that didn't work that well. And now 3 years ago, a bit more than 3 years ago, starting Ofload. And so they kind of all make sense combined, because I progressively entered a world in which you need to be an entrepreneur in order to be successful and truly drive change. And I've always been the kid that loved business, whether I was 14 and trying to sell bicycle parts from China. I've always been interested in trading, in doing things myself. And I'm not a big theoretical guy. I like action. I've got a big bias for action. So that has been there for ages.
Yeah. And so in 3 years, you've gone from sort of basically zero to, I think you raised about 60 million last year. Is that about right?
Yeah. We've raised just short of 100 million in total.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a fast growing company and presumably a global opportunity.
So the pain points that we solve for exist in every single market around the world. And the way to go about solving them tend to be very similar. So indeed, we have a global play at stake, but the local opportunity is big enough. It's $65 billion worth. So we're going to focus on Australia first, nailing this market, creating value for everyone involved before we get distracted in trying to go global. I think there's a lot of value being very strong locally and creating a lot of value for our different users and different clients. So we will stick to Australia for the time being.
Yeah. And as you've grown, I noticed that you've actually, it's not just organic growth. You're now looking at growth by acquisition. Is that something that's, what sort of mix going forward are you looking at in terms of how you want to grow the business?
It's a great point. I think usually, and that's more to reassure investors, right? But you need to show that the market responds well to your product, right? That the product actually solves genuine pain points. And so we've done that. We grew 9x the second year, 7x the third year. We're now growing still rapidly. But I also wanted to showcase that in parallel, there's a genuine flywheel of growth triggered through the network effect. And so what I wanted to do with my first M&A acquisition was to show that both sides, whether you're on the supplier side in a trucking company or whether you're an Australian business moving freight around, there is genuine value to actually enter our network and enter our platform and our software. Yeah. And so that's the exercise I've gone through and acquired a business in September last year. And we've since then showcased it. I think we grew that business 50%. And while keeping the same headcount, so the genuine kind of scalability that technology offers. And I will consider doing about 1 to 2 similar deals per year in the years to come.
Yeah. And how's that been in terms of bedding that acquisition down? Has it been easier than you thought, more difficult? How did that process go?
The good thing is that the level of risk is actually not huge in the sense that we acquire those businesses for a low multiple of EBITDA, because they're not very liquid business. They're only as strong as the ledger is. You're not buying any assets. We're buying analog brokers in the freight industry. So we don't have a massive financial risk. So the true genuine challenge is always post-merger integration. And that
Yeah.
is mixing two different cultures, two different mindsets, two different
Yeah.
companies,
Okay.
and making sure that you retain the talents, that you make sure that you actually onboard the clients in different ways of working and behaviors. And so all our focus has been put on the PMI piece.
Yeah. And as you've progressed, what would you say your biggest strength is as the leader of these businesses and bringing in this other business? What's your biggest strength that you see?
My biggest strength is probably the awareness that I don't hold audiences, that I'm not the most skilled person around the table, and every single one of my leaders are stronger than I am in at least one aspect, and in some cases in a number of aspects. So I've always been very good at pick and choosing the ideas rather than coming with my own. I have my own ideas. I have my own areas where I am fully confident to be able to get to the answer myself very quickly. But I also have a full awareness that sometimes the best ideas are around the table. So I'm very good at listening and getting every single one to raise their voice and to speak their mind. And then I often come with an answer that is a mix of everything that I've heard.
Yeah. Okay. And before I go too much further, do you just want to explain to the listeners what your business does in terms of its logistics and just a little bit more information, just so that people understand
Yeah,
the
so
idea?
it's a good point because we do play a very interesting role, right? The market, and as I said in Australia, it's about $65 billion worth of freight spend. And there's two players. There's the businesses that are trying to move freight around, and you can think of large names like Coca-Cola's, like Pepsi, like Danone, all of those shelves that you see in the supermarkets are the sum of multiple businesses just gathering their products in one place. And that's the same with everywhere. Every single thing that you see, the chair you're sitting on, all of that has been on multiple trucks, right? And so there's thousands of Australian businesses or multinational businesses trying to move freight. And there's about 48,000 trucking companies trying to move that freight in the most organized way possible.
Yeah.
But the reality is that those 48,000 trucking companies all act inside or compete with each other, which creates massive and natural inefficiencies around 30% of the trucks drive empty all the time. 50%
Yeah.
of the time, they don't even drive, they're idle. 70% of the time, they're not even completely full when they do have freight in their trucks. And the natural interesting thing is out of the 48,000 trucking companies, actually 98% of them are part of the long tail, have less than 10 trucks. So
Right.
there's a massive long tail. The top dogs combined hold 12% market share. And then you got a massive long tail of smaller trucking companies that tend to be what we call in Australia subbies, subcontractors. They work for larger companies, larger trucking companies. And so there's in general between the freight owner and the freight operator, there's actually about 2.4 middlemen of actually taking a cut throughout the chain and giving the work to the long tail of the owner operators or the smaller Australian freight companies. And what we do is say, well, let's find a way to be that like central authority, to be that middleman in the middle, trying to understand the predictability of freight, trying to optimize the freight for multiple suppliers or multiple multinational and great big FMCG players. And let's try to optimize in such a way that we remove the empty miles, we fill the trucks completely, we utilize the truck better, and then we allocate the trucks to the trucking companies for whom it's the most relevant. We allocated for the trucking company that was meant to drive empty. We allocated to the trucking company that actually had 5 pallet spaces empty. And so we leverage data, algorithms, machine learning tools in order to optimize the freight and then optimize the trucks of the trucking companies we optimize for. We have about 1,500 trucking companies in our platform, which is about 17,000 trucks for whom we optimize their freight. And so we are telling our clients and the big players, don't onboard overhead, don't hire 10 more people to manage the complexity of freight. We provide you with all the tools and
Yep.
all the visibility, the analytics, and that helps you to be leaner. And then we tell all of our suppliers, don't invest in BDMs, don't invest in operational people. We will take care through technology to find you work and relevant work and optimize it for you. So you focus on managing your drivers, your fleet, and staying the leanest you can, because there's efficiency in how lean those trucking companies are.
And presumably, if you're looking at all of that lack of efficiency that's there in a very fragmented market, if suddenly you can increase the amount of freight that you can put on a truck, but there's no extra cost. You're already doing that load. That's straight to the bottom line, presumably, or pretty close to it
It absolutely
for the
is.
truck operators.
Absolutely is. There's something interesting that in the past kind of decades, usually there has been what we call brokers, which is middlemen, people using a ledger, using a network of trucking companies and using volume to squeeze prices down. The
Yeah.
great thing about what we do is that the exact opposite. We bring more profitability to the trucking companies. We make them more efficient. We make them leaner, and we also save money to all of the freight and all of the Australian businesses that are our clients. So it's a win-win situation. Everyone wins from it. There's an increased profitability and there's a reduced cost on the other end.
And in terms of technologies that are coming into the industry where you're operating, I mean, there's two that probably are pretty obvious, but one would be AI and machine learning. The other would be driverless trucks as they come in. I mean, it's obviously into the future, but how do you see those contributing to your business, given that I have read that it's actually difficult to get truck drivers? There's capacity, but it's hard to get drivers. So what does driverless trucks mean for your business?
I think the lowest hanging fruit here is going to be around AI for now.
Yeah.
Just because a lot of the freight that moves in Australia is predictable, right? Most businesses don't grow double digit year on year. They're single growth phase. They know exactly whatever the patterns of freight moving around, the peak season of Christmas, stuff, Easter, and usually what demand is for their own business. So there's a higher level of predictability, and what we're aiming for is to have a satellite view of where freight needs to go at all times and where trucks are at all times. And so once we penetrate further into the demand side, further into the visibility of the supply side and where trucks are at all times, the matching and coordination piece is solely going to be done through AI and machine learning. And so that's where the strength comes. And so what we need to do is continue to gain market share, because that's where the network effect is, because we then understand the market further and better. And we have more data points. Every single shipment is the sum of data points, whether it's an origin, a destination, a cost, a capacity, and every single thing is actually a sum of data sets that makes us stronger. And so that's where AI can come in. In terms of driverless trucks, I think we are a bit out. I always think that I remember when I was a bit younger and I was told like around mid 2000 or 2010, we'll have like flying cars. I don't think it's that much of a stretch, but it's still something that we are far away. I think there's something to be said around making our roads safer, our drivers safer. And that's through technology, that's through assisted driving, that's through technologies like Tesla that are super strong in self-driving trucks, assisted by human. I do think that this will help to make this industry more compelling to the young generations that are not entering this industry, that don't want to be drivers, because it is tough to drive 13 hours from Sydney to Brisbane. It is tough to drive in 10 hours from Sydney to Melbourne. And so we need to make that industry more compelling. I think technology will help bring more labor force into that industry. But before we actually have a network of self-driving trucks around Australia, I think we're a couple of decades away.
Decades away. Okay, that's interesting. So AI in the short term is where the low-hanging fruit is.
Absolutely is.
Yeah, okay. And as a leader, talking about your strengths, what about your weaknesses? What's your biggest weaknesses, and how do you overcome them in this business as you've grown?
My biggest weakness is that I am actually, you said it yourself at the beginning, Dion, but the reality is that this company has evolved very, very quickly. It is a full and a bit years old. And so what was required of me 3 years ago is very different to what is required of me now. We have about 130 staff. There's a lot of structure. There's 4.5 layers in the business. When I started this, I had no office and I was working off the Coogee Pavilion in Sydney, right? So I need to evolve as quickly as my business does. I need to be able to delegate, to trust, to empower, but at the same time, keep awareness. So while I have a lot of weaknesses, but the biggest one is actually for myself to keep up evolving from being a founder to a CEO and allowing to know what actually creates the most value. What is my new Pareto law? Where is my 80-20, right? And how do I achieve awareness and keep the details of how every team are going and my finger on the pulse, but how do I also delegate enough so that my leaders are truly empowered to then drive themselves, because they'll go faster than me trying to do everything at once. So probably delegation and trusting and empowering the team is probably currently the transition I'm going into. that will lead me to become more of a CEO than a founder.
And that is a rapid change. I mean, every year you must be having to go through that sort of transition to go, hang on, we were here starting from zero, and now we're at this point. And another year later, it's every year, it's a completely different business almost in terms of the learning curve you've had to go through to manage that new business, if you like. I mean, I know it's not a new business, but you know what I'm saying in terms of the size and scale and the problems that you're dealing with and the opportunities. Very different from by year to year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Right. The level of communication, the level of transparency, the visibility of scope, the processes you build, they're very different, right? From a business where everyone is aware of everything to a business that we now more than 100 people, you need to structure your business differently. So the business needs different things. Also, almost different leaders at times. So how do we make sure that we then train our leaders? How do I make sure I train myself and upskill myself? So that is a challenge. And to your point, right, I think about 50% of the headcount is less than a year. So it's a lot of new people. So once the DNA was clear for all the early joiners, how do you maintain the same culture throughout when everyone is joining at a different stages of the business, which is a different environment, right? So how do you make everyone on the same boat, on the same journey, and on the same kind of vibe or energy kind of frequency? So that is the challenge that we constantly have to go through. I'm hoping that it won't stop because it's a good problem. It means that you're worrying. It means that you're having the painful growth and there's pain in growth, but at least it's one that comes through the fact that you're actually doing something that is creating value. So I'm not going to complain, but I'm just saying that indeed it puts the highlights in the spotlight on every leader has.
Yeah. And what are some of the things that you do within the business to maintain that culture or to grow that culture? What are a couple of examples that you do trying to manage that process with new people?
A good point. It used to be spontaneous and it now it can no longer be spontaneous. So the onboarding phase is probably one of the most precious. I consider that every single new employee brings like a new set of eyes to the problem. And so if they have fresh blood, but wants to drive change. And so I nurture that phase for an onboarding, which means that every single person I actually onboard in terms of the vision and the values myself. So I do an onboarding for every single employee that we get in a 1 hour session where they tell them all about the vision, all about what we stand for, what does the journey must look like, and what does the end goal look like. And then everyone is actually then onboarded in every single team so that they have full awareness of what's going on for the business. So the first couple of days, they don't actually work. They just get to understand the business.
Okay.
And then we organize specific team events regularly, that are team building events, company-wide events we do once a quarter. So everyone can gather together. We have town hall sessions at monthly. We have updates weekly on the business. So we've just improved a lot more communication across the business. And probably the biggest change is that now when assessing if talent is the right time to join Offload, we actually have a culture fit interview that is specifically around the culture.
Okay.
Because we can't improvise culture. Culture is not the coming from luck. If you want to have a specific culture, you got to make sure that you hire people that align with those values and behaviors. And so within that process, we now built an HR function that assesses every single candidate solely through that set of eyes.
And how new is that? Have you had a chance to see how that flows through and the impact of it, or is it still too new and too early to tell?
So I've seen the impact of not having it.
Right.
And that was painful. Meaning that we naturally had every single team had almost a different culture set, and everyone were different. We had different leaders that were managing that team differently, that had different ways of providing feedback, and that were more assertive, some less assertive. And so we had massive gaps, and we didn't have the same culture across the entire business. And we actually rectified this very, very quickly by training every single leader and by implementing what I've just said, which we implemented about 8 months ago. So we've already seen results now, and we have a far more cohesive company than we used to.
Yeah. And when you've brought in partners, raising money, that sort of stuff, is it a venture capital type people or is it industry type groups? What's the mix within that?
So the mix is interesting because in the world we used to live, beyond, which is not the world we live in now, but in the world we used to live, money was pretty easy to find if you had a business model that was working well. And so we were in a position in which we considered that not every dollar is equal. A dollar for someone that doesn't bring value is not the same as a dollar that someone that can. And so we specifically decided to tackle and get a bit of strategic partners on board. We have Maersk, which is one of the biggest shipping in the world. We have then a very large warehousing company, which is called Lineage Logistics, which is the biggest refrigerated warehousing company in the world, but is a strategic investor. And then we have a specialized supply chain VC. So we have Fundamental, which is a smaller one based in Berlin. We have Jungle, which is the largest one in Singapore that led the $60 million round in December. And we have then a long tail of smaller traditional VCs.
Yeah. And how important has that been in terms, because obviously lots of companies do things differently, but I really like the idea of having those strategic partners because of the doors that opens up to for any business, and especially in a business like you're talking about, it makes complete sense to have those types of partners. Do you see those sorts of impacts, and would you have done it differently in any other way?
I probably wouldn't have done it differently. I think that the surprising manner, they've all created almost as much value. The VCs have guided me a lot through the need of early on leading the white finance team, getting a chief of staff to support me to be able to do even more at the same time. And so they kind of seen a lot of companies grow and go through the same pain. And so there's a lot of learnings that you can get from those specific investors, and from strategic investors. We've gone through a lot of learning curve where we've just literally downloaded all of their experience for different leaders of different functions. We've been able to tap into a lot of expertise, and that has been super valuable from a network of clients to actually properly understand how things are done, to actually sometimes have integrations with some of them. So it's been a very good mix of investors, and I don't think that I would have done differently. Probably I could have done it better in the sense I could have extracted more value. I was probably structured about it early on, but as a typical founder, you kind of start a journey thinking that you can do it all alone, and then you realize that you need support.
Yeah. And what about the best decisions you've made along the way? So over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of different things that you've had to decide on or put in place. What would you say would be the best, or the best couple of things that you've decided on?
Two things. One that are business focused is that I've been very stubbornly focused on what is our core. Where do we create the most value? And not try to grab every single shiny low-hanging opportunity. I have grabbed a few, and I will keep on being opportunistic, but having the right blend of being how strategical you are and how opportunistic you are. And opportunities are great, but they are massive distractions if they are not in line with your core and your end vision. And so I haven't gone too distracted at trying to be everything to everyone. I've been able to say no. I've been able to adapt and adjust to my client needs. And I've also been able to stay crystal focused on what our end goal are and what our vision is. So that is something that I think is very important to every single new business, because when you're young, you tend to want to grab revenue at all costs. And sometimes cost is not just distractions. Sometimes it's actually losing money for a lot of ventures out there, a lot of businesses, which is not the case for us. But so I've been able to stay very focused. And so that's one aspect to the answer. And the second one is I haven't been too precious in regards to fundraising. I've never tried to be, let's go with the high valuation. I'm going to wait. I'm going to squeeze. I've always said what my priority as a leader is to safeguard the shares that every single employee has in my business. Every single employee has shares in this business. Safeguard their job, safeguard this business, and not try to optimize for a couple of percent. And so I've always fundraised way before I needed to. Right. I've fundraised a 60 million Series B when actually budget-wise, I could have gone profitable before I needed it. Because I need to build a war chest. I'm not taking any gambles. I'm not a gambler. And so I build a sustainable business, and I want to make sure that I deal with the business very quickly. And that's paying off big time now because the market is turning. We are still burning money because we invest in growth, but we have more than 5 years runway, which is the luxury.
Right. Yeah, it's huge. And that is especially as markets can change pretty quickly when it comes to capital. And when everything's good, everything, everything looks easy. But once it turns, it's a completely different ball game. So to have raised that money when you did, I think is very wise.
Thank you. And I agree.
What about in terms of challenges? The first thing that comes to mind, especially when it comes to logistics, is COVID, because you basically don't know, in terms of your business, you don't know a world without it. It's sort of from the start of the business, it's been around, right? So how did COVID impact the business and also the staff and how you manage your people?
So you've asked a question early on how global Offload will become, or is it a global play? I first started the business with the intention of being global from day one. So when I launched the business in March 2020, well, officially in March 2020, but in Q1 2020, let's say, I had two teams. I had hired some great, super smart ex-McKinsey team and leaders in Indonesia, and I had about 12 staff in Indonesia. And then I had and I was launching the Indonesian market at the same time I was launching Australian market. And so I had asked all those people to resign from whatever jobs they had, which were great jobs, and I convinced them and brought them on board. And then in March, we understand that the world is different. The world is changing. We now kind of lost a lot of freedom. We now have every single VCs panicking, not knowing, is it the end of the world? Is it an opportunity to seize? And so things were freezing. People had literally no bandwidth to try to invest. And so I started the business, and I had, in February, March, I had until about October in terms of money before the company to shut down and go for bankruptcy, because it was an early company. So very early on, I had to make a very hard decision to actually fire everyone I just hired in Indonesia.
Right.
So 4 months after, I had to fire them because it was either that or I only had a month to live before I had no more cash. And so I had to cut half of my team and shut down the entire Indonesian market to safeguard Australia. And thankfully, 2 months later, that extended runway that I acquired through letting those people go allowed me to raise a couple of million from Maersk and GFC Global Founder Capital, which made now Offload possible and now what it is. And so that early challenge of going through panic and thinking that I will not have more than a couple of weeks of money and shut down the business taught me a lot. I think the mistake of convincing and asking those people to resign and come on board made me realize the obligation I have as a leader, that people are not just an output. They're actually true, genuine people that have a mortgage, that have kids, that take bets and trust the leader to take the right decision. And I hadn't. Not that I could foresee the challenge, but I made a mistake that impacted them negatively. So that gave me a great sense of carefulness in terms of when I hire, I need to make sure I will never let that person go. I will never do redundancies, Leon. I will never hire too quickly because there's opportunities to get cash in the market and grow faster. I will always be very considerate in how I deploy cash and how I ask people to change their life and join the adventure. So that has been a big challenge that taught me a lot.
And in terms of that, did it really make you aware, I guess, of the magnitude of the responsibility of when things go wrong? And it does for everybody, right, at different times. And this was out of your control. And it's as much a risk and a gamble employing people as it is for people to join a business, and everyone understands that. But did it really just highlight just the magnitude of that responsibility when you're bringing people on?
It does, and I think that what put it on steroid, what you just said, is the fact that I was even younger. Right? Today I'm 33, and so I was literally 29 and a bit at the time, and so I was super young and a bit naive, and I never gone through crisis. Right? I never had genuine massive failures. I had challenges for sure, but this was a wake up call to how serious it is to be an entrepreneur. We only hear about the success stories, and so we never truly understand the pain or the difficult decisions or how we affected lives through being a leader and an entrepreneur. And that kind of gave me very, very quickly an awareness about the responsibility that actually a leader should have. And a leader is not just here to try to be part of Forbes 30 under 30 or whatever prestige people think that it is worth having. It's very much around the people. And so that kind of, we put the focus where it should be very early on.
And is that what's directly influenced your sort of conservatism when it comes to having more money in the bank than you might need and those sorts of things? Was it that experience specifically, or have you always been a little bit that way inclined?
I think I've always been like that because the business that I started is one in which cash flow is very clear. The go to profitability path is very clear. It's not one that needs to wait for 50 years in order to scale and
Yeah,
get
yeah,
the volume to have a profit, right? And we could talk about models like the Uber car sharing and so on. Like I would never be that kind of founder.
yeah,
I need to believe in the value creates. I need to believe in the economics and fundamentals of those businesses. So by nature, I have a bias for something that is clear and
yeah,
not a moonshot. And also, I think that experience for sure did remind me that around labor and around talent acquisition and around retention,
yeah,
that it's essential to be a thoughtful leader.
yeah. And how did COVID impact the business itself? Did it
Uh,
increase revenue or decrease? Or I mean, you've got stuff stops moving, right?
it was obviously, it became amazing at the beginning of 2021. Freight demand just skyrocketed because people had a lot more purchasing power. They did not spend, they did not travel. And so they started consuming a lot more.
Yeah,
And so consumption went through the roof. In a market in which people had COVID, truck drivers could not drive anymore. Borders were sometimes shut. Sometimes there was testing that needed to be done between a border to another, right? Australia is complex in that sense. And there's a state policy. And so all of those challenges meant there was a lot less capacity in the market, but then every single client, they had a lot more demand. And so there's
okay,
the biggest mismatch with everything between demand and supply was during COVID, which meant that any traditional model, meaning that when you hire a big company that has 10,000 trucks, well, if you need 10,000 in one truck, well, they can't, right? They don't have more capacity than the number of trucks they have. But our model is, by a position, very different because we have an unlimited amount of capacity because we tap into whatever trucking company exists. So, and we have 17,000 trucks. So we had far more capacity. So we had an opportunity to showcase our value a lot faster. And there was a
right.
need for our offering and a need for our nimbleness and a need for data and a need for visibility that increased rapidly and faster than it would naturally. So we went through a massive amount of growth. And now that we've managed to kind of showcase our value, we have the network effect or the word to mouth happening. So we're still growing about the same time, even when demand is now flattening. And as you know,
Yep.
inflation, the rising cost of cash, which and the
Yep.
RBA increasing the cash rate and so on means that demand is going down, but our growth is still going up.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about advice that you've had from, presumably you've got mentors or people that have given you insights into business from all sorts of places, but what's some of the best advice you've been given along the way?
They tend to always be the simplest ones. And the reality is that the timing of when they're being said is as relevant as what is being said. And, and for me, very early on in my life, I realized that the biggest enemy was myself. The doubts that I had, the imposter syndrome that I might have, the fact that I would tell myself that it wasn't possible before I even tested it, before I even heard it from someone else. And so I realized I was putting stick in my bicycle and in the wheels myself. And I was
Yeah.
falling because of my lack of belief that things are possible. And so someone in my network kind of always reminded me throughout my early stages of career that everything was possible as long as I tried. And so I've quickly put myself in, failure is actually an amazing opportunity to learn. And so I love failing. And as a business, I'd rather fail 10 times than take as much time in trying to get the perfect answer that still has a likelihood of being incorrect. And so I fail, I go and I try and I never stop. And never, ever, ever take no for an answer, whether you're an investor, you're a client, whoever you are. I don't live in a world in which things are impossible.
Yeah. Okay. That's good advice. All right. I've got final 4 quick questions to
Yeah.
finish off. What, who's a business person that inspires you the most and why?
It's going to be boring, but it had to be Elon Musk because I like the
Yeah.
fact that he made a great outcome with PayPal and the business he sold to PayPal and then PayPal, but he never stopped. He
Yeah.
never, he's relentless. And he's driving change at the magnitude that no one else is.
Yeah.
So admire it.
Yeah. It's, a common answer, but a very valid and a very good answer, because the stuff that he does is just incredible. And as far as someone who can execute on big vision, amazing. What about business books? Any business books in particular that you would recommend?
There's one, not that is like, it's just one that reminds you the importance of the Pareto law, the 80-20, and it's the 4-hour week book.
Yep.
By Tim Ferriss, because I think like the enemy of pace is perfectionist and trying to have the perfect answer all the time. And being able to prioritize is essential to be able to do a lot of things at the same time.
Yep.
And so that reminds you the fact that there are things that create value, there are things that don't. And focus on things that actually do, because sometimes they take a lot less time.
Yeah. And what about, do you have any particular quotes or maxims that you go by on business or life or leadership? Anything that with you?
Yes, there's one which for show off, and it's one that, because I have a bias for action. I don't stand still and just say and then contemplate things. And so I believe that to become the change you want to see in the world is true within your business. It's true in everything you do. Drive that change. If you want things to change, do it. Become that change first. Stop complaining. Stop trying to tell yourself it's not possible. Just be that change. Be whatever you want to see.
Yeah. Just get on with it.
Just get on with it.
Yeah. It's a very underrated piece of advice, I think, these days. And well, what's next for Offload?
I mean, now it's all about consolidating our growth. It's about building a steady business. It's about being building the muscle of being able to acquire more businesses, which is an expertise in itself. And so the next 3 years are going to be around that, and then we'll contemplate what does an exit look like.
Yeah.
Is it IPO because we have great fundamentals and we'll have a very, very strong EBITDA, or is it going to be a trade sale? And so it's going to be investigating all of those alternatives out there. Yeah. And me personally is trying to always be aware, am I still the perfect CEO for this business? And making sure that I upskill myself or that I bring the right talent to support me.
Yeah. And that's an interesting question too, isn't it? That who's the best person to be the CEO is, and I've seen this come up from time to time where people who found the founders of the business sometimes come to a point where they say, "This is not me from now on," or "At this point, it's not going to be me." So that's an interesting concept, and maybe it always will be, but you've got to reinvent yourself as you go along, don't you?
Yeah, you absolutely need to, and you need to be aware when you're not. And there will be a point in time when you're not, whether you're 0 to 5 or 0 to 80, there will be an 80 to 100 required at some point if your business is successful. So you need to understand what is your skill set, what are your strengths, and selfishly, where do you find your happiness? What fulfills you in that journey? It does only 0 to 20 fulfill you. In that case, maybe you should get generals around you and people to support you, but you focus on things that actually drive your energy.
Yeah. But that's not necessarily selfish either. I mean, it isn't in terms of, but it's critical, right? Because if you don't love what you do, then you're not going to do it as well. So it becomes a point where, managing 1,000 people just isn't as fun as what it used to be when it was a team of 100, 150. Well, go back to doing something that you really do enjoy, because you won't do it as well otherwise.
Absolutely blind.
Geoffroy, thank you very much for your time, mate. It's been fantastic. Really enjoyed hearing about your journey and the company and progress and how much you've achieved in such a short amount of time. Like, that's really incredible. And I really look forward to seeing what the next 3, 4, 5 years hold. It's an exciting journey.
Thank you very much. And let's never forget, it's always the sum of hard work and luck. Like, it doesn't come without luck, neither without hard work.
Yeah, very well said. All right, mate. We'll let you go. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye, Jim.
Thanks, mate.